Hello and welcome back everybody. Today we are going to be going over 10 very strong builds for the Scout class as of Season 4. Since Season 4, a lot of stuff has changed since last time I did build videos like this. I don't think I did them through Season 3, and Scout got a lot of changes. Pretty much every class got a lot of changes, with maybe Inji being the exception. But regardless, I'm going to be going over 10 of the strongest builds for Scout, or 10 very strong builds for Scout. These aren't necessarily the strongest builds because a lot of these builds are super flexible, and I will not be reusing the same overclock in any one of these builds. So feel free to mix and match however you would like and tell me what your favorites are, because otherwise it would be very easy for me to just go, oh yeah, Hipster plus insert secondary here, Hipster plus special powder, Hipster plus embedded detonators, Hipster plus jumbo shells, Hipster plus Bodkin Points. That would be way too easy for this if we just have a really strong overclock like that one. So I'm also going to be using the site Karl.gg. This is an amazing site that shows all the build guides, as well as it shows you all of your various bonuses here. So we can see damage, we can see magazine size, we can see even like potential total damage if we hit with everything, weak spot damage. It can be really useful for mixing and matching and building a complete picture of what your loadout is going to kind of work like, at least on paper, maybe not in the actual game. So really good resource, and you can also save your builds here and look through other people's builds too, so you can see what other people are running. So without further ado, let's get into this list. The very first build is a classic Scout build that has been very strong for the longest time. This is the M1000 with Hipster attached to it, which, like I said, Hipster is really strong. Hipster actually technically got nerfed in this patch, where the M1000 itself got buffed, which is great. It got increased rate of fire thanks to the input buffer delay, so you can spam it now faster if you just click faster. But in doing that, they decided to nerf Hipster down one of its rate of fire so that it wouldn't be too crazy. And it feels basically the same as it did before, so it's still very strong and it's still super flexible. The way I usually like building Hipster is like this, going with more ammo, armor breaking, larger magazine size, blow-through rounds, and then the faster reload. Although you can build Hipster in a ton of ways. This is more of a spam fire Hipster build. You could build it for damage and still have it be kind of spam fire. You could build it for focus shots. Focus shot Hipster is actually okay too, weirdly enough. And you could also just build this as a hybrid mix of whatever you'd like. Armor breaking is really useful in tier 2. That would be one that I would highly recommend, as well as blow-through rounds in tier 4 can also be very useful with this build, since most of the time you're just going to be firing the normal shots. Tier 5 though, you can pick whatever you'd like. The other tiers, it's completely your choice. And then to pair with this, I'm running the Zukovs with embedded detonators. This one is really strong. It's one of the Zukov's strongest overclocks, and just a super strong overclock in general. Lowers your damage, lowers your ammo, lowers your magazine size, but now it sticks embedded detonators into any enemy, and when you go to reload, it detonates those, dealing very high damage to them. This is great for picking off big things. It can be useful for picking off crowds of smaller enemies. You do have to be a little bit conservative with your shots because you don't have as many, and this is the way that I usually build it. So I'm running extra ammo in tier 1. Usually you just want to go with ammo. Damage does not transfer to the embedded detonators themselves, so that will only be direct damage on the bullet hitting. And since it nerfs the damage and most of your damage is coming from the explosion, doesn't really make sense to build damage with this one. Tier 2, it's your choice. I'm going to faster reloads though, but larger mag size or faster rate of fire is good. Tier 3, increased accuracy. It just makes it easier to hit, and again, damage isn't really worth it. Tier 4, I like going with more ammo here because it usually gets you the most value out of these. Weak spot damage just isn't worth going for with this build, and blow-through rounds can work because you can actually stick double detonators into enemies, but it's very difficult to actually get a lot of value out of that, and you'll usually just get more value from more bullets. And then in tier 5, I'm going with conductive bullets so that we can get even more damage out of this, but you can take this with get in, get out too if you want that extra reload speed, or sorry, extra movement speed. Both these weapons combined are really strong. Just use the M1000 for basically anything, especially at range, and then for big single targets, switch to the Zukovs. You can pair this with whatever grenade you would like. A lot of people like pairing it with the IFG so that you get the maximum amount of damage and the maximum amount of burst damage. That works. I was playing this and basically all these loadouts with the boomerang the other day, so that works too. Pheromones can also work. Cryo grenade also works. They all complement this build very well, and this build is just a super strong build if you want to kill basically everything with Scout. And it's also very ammo efficient because Hipster takes forever to run out of bullets. Moving on to our second build, we're going to be using the GK2 as our primary weapon, and we're going to be using compact ammo. Compact ammo is a fantastic clean overclock that just gets you a slightly larger magazine size, as well as it gives you increased recoil reduction, so it makes the assault rifle just more consistent overall. The GK2 got a massive rework at the latter half of Season 3 to where it is far better than it used to be, and just with a couple tweaks, it's really, really nice now. This is a simple assault rifle build that can kind of do everything. It does well against big enemies, it does well against crowds, it does very well at range. The way I like running it is like this, so I'm going with faster reload speed in tier 1, but any of them in tier 1 will work, they're all really good. More ammo in tier 2, damage is also an option here if you want to kill big things a little bit quicker. I like going with the extra ammo just so that I have a little bit more sustained fire for crowds. Larger magazine size in tier 3, you could go with either this or the recoil reduction, they're both really good. Recoil reduction makes it so this is extremely accurate. You have like 65% recoil reduction or something like that. So you don't bounce around very much. If you find the GK2 bounces a little bit, you could take that one. I like the larger mag size though to go up to 45 rounds in the magazine. Makes it so you have a lot of sustained fire. Extra weak spot damage in tier 4, but you could go with armor breaking too. And then extra rate of fire in tier 5. That way we can just shoot this more often. Very simple, very straightforward, but it works very well against basically everything. As for a secondary, we're going to be pairing this with Jumbo Shells. Jumbo Shells is an unstable overclock for the boomstick that just lets you hit really hard. You don't have as many shots as you normally do, but that doesn't matter. We're going to be using the assault rifle for most things at range and most crowds, and then if crowds get a little bit too close to you, or if there's big things, you switch over to your jumbo shells and you just smack them with that and do really high damage. The way I have it built is like this, very simple, going with extra ammo in tier 1. Usually you don't need extra damage. It already does enough damage with this, even against larger enemies. You could take it if you want to just hit dreadnoughts particularly hard. Then I go with increased reload speed in tier 2. Reload speed has been changed so that it actually works the way it is supposed to, or I guess the boomstick works the way it's supposed to from this last patch. So the extra rate of fire doesn't make it so your reloads come out quicker. Reload speed is actually worth taking now with this one. You could go with the double trigger though if you'd like and just have more burst damage. More pellets in tier 3 so we get even more damage from this, although you could go with ammo. Blow through rounds in tier 4. This is to use against crowds if they do get up close so that we can just clear off a bunch of them all at once. And then white phosphorus rounds so that we have some fire damage on our boomstick as well. You could also take Fear of the Boomstick, that works pretty well with this one too. This build is extremely straightforward. Use the boomstick up close and for big enemies, and then use the GK2 for everything else at range. For our third build, we're going to be making use of the Drak Plasma Carbine, and the first overclock that we're going to be using is Impact Deflection. Impact Deflection makes it so we have a slightly less rate of fire with the Drak, but it's still fairly high, and we get the bonus of our rounds get to bounce one more time. That can be really useful for crowds. It's actually extremely useful for swarmers, and the way I have it built is like this. We're going with faster cooling in tier 1 so that we don't build up as much heat. I actually think this is heat resistant. More ammo in tier 2 so that we can continue shooting this more than we otherwise would. In tier 3 we're going to faster cooldown so that we can just keep up the fire, although the increased accuracy or the hot feet can also work in this tier. In tier 4, I really like the splash with this particular overclock. I would recommend that one just because you can hit once, splash damage to everything, and then your round bounces, hits something else, and splashes damage to everything there. Does really well against crowds. This won't likely matter that much against really big enemies like Praetorians and Oppressors, but it does make a difference in grunt swarms and in swarmer swarms. And then in tier 5, I'm going with a feedback loop. This is just for faster rate of fire once we get the heat so high. It should be easy to keep the heat relatively high during fights, and then kind of just let the cooling take over from that, so that way we're not overheating the weapon too much. Since this weapon specializes so heavily in crowd control, we're going with a secondary weapon that does well against single targets. And for that, we're going to be using Trifork Volley with the crossbow. This lets you fire out 3 bolts every time that you shoot the crossbow. You can't pick these bolts back up, but they do very high damage and very high burst damage. As well as we're going to be taking electric rounds with this crossbow. You can take any round you would like. If you like pheromones, you can take that. If you like the explosive bolts, you can also take those. The electric bolts are very useful for big single targets though, like oppressors and dreadnoughts, because you stick 2 of them on an enemy and they move super slow. It also works on Herald. I just found that out the other day. Shoot 2 of the bolts onto the Corruptor and he can't move very fast either. That's very nice. So we're going with electricity bolts in tier 1 and in tier 5 because those kind of work well together. Going with extra ammo in tier 2, you could go with more damage here if you would like, if you think that's necessary to have more burst. More ammo I find a little bit more useful for this one because every time you miss, it does kind of hurt since you're likely missing with all 3 bolts or at least a portion of your bolts. Tier 3, I'm going with the faster reload speed. This one can use it because it does reload a bit slower and it helps with your swap speed. And then in tier 4, the faster movement once we actually do kill something with this. So you kill something and then you can run away or run to a better position and reset your crossbow once again. You're going to be using the Drak just for clearing off smaller enemies, swarmers, grunts, things like that. You can still do damage to Praetorians with it, no problem. And then switch to the crossbow to deal with really big targets, even more crowd control if it is something large like a Dreadnought or a Praetorian or an Oppressor, whatever it might be. Slow them down, that way you can easily wrap around them and hit them with the Trifork Volley. For our fourth build, we're going back to the M1000, and this time we're going for a lot of single target damage with it. This time we're taking Super Cooling Chamber, which Super Cooling Chamber also got buffed in Season 3, which is very cool. It's no longer such a meme anymore, it's actually pretty good. Before it wasn't really that great of an option because basically all the other overclocks kind of just outshadowed it for just overall damage. This one does have a lot of burst damage now though. So Super Cooling Chamber makes it so you have to sit still once you're using your focus shot, as well as your focus shots now do a lot more damage, at least when they hit weak spots, and you also have less ammo and you focus slower. Those are kind of bad things, but that's okay. Scout can get to some really good positions very quickly with their grappling hook, so the slowdown doesn't matter too much, and we do have a build that kind of mitigates it. For this, I'm running extra ammo. I would highly recommend more ammo in Tier 1. That way you go back up to a normal amount of ammunition for the M1000. Damage just isn't worth it for this build. If you're going with the Giga Chad Scout build, it's necessary, but regular Super Cooling Chamber, probably not. Faster focus in Tier 2. That will help quite a bit. Armor breaking and recoil reduction aren't really necessary with this one. The focus is a lot better. Then more damage in Tier 3. More weak spot damage in Tier 4, that way we're just embracing all of the weak spot damage, and faster reloads in Tier 5, but you can pick whatever you'd like in Tier 5. All of them are good. The fear is actually pretty decent with this one for having some level of crowd control with it. Main thing that you're going to be doing with this weapon is trying to keep your distance and just pick off really big targets. So Oppressors, Praetorians, Menaces, Nexuses, Breeders, anything like that, you can kill extremely fast with this. Even more so if you have like critical weakness. I think you can one-shot any of those on critical weakness with this particular overclock, although critical weakness is crazy strong with any build. Now, in order to play a sniper role effectively, you do want to keep yourself safe. And to do that, we're going to be taking a secondary that's a little bit of an odd one. We're going to be taking Bodkin Points for the crossbow. Bodkin Points makes it so every time that you hit an enemy, your bolt will then bounce into up to 2 more enemies, and it actually does have improved pathing from when Bodkin Points first came out. The way I like building it is like this, all on the left-hand side, so pheromone bolts, that way enemies stay away from us, so we can stay at a safe distance, and this way we can just hit Praetorians and Oppressors with those. Damage so we can one-shot grunts, faster reload speed just so that we can use this more often, faster movement speed, so if we need to run away we can, and then the potent special bolts in Tier 5, that way our pheromones last even longer. I just like using the crossbow for all the crowds, and my grenade for the crowds. Again, I was usually using this with the boomerang, which works really well with this build. That way you have some sort of small enemy clear, like the jellyfish or the swarmers. Use the crossbow for any sort of swarms. It clears up grunts pretty easily, and it can even stun things like Praetorians pretty easily. And then just use Super Cooling Chamber for one-shotting any sort of the really big enemies, or at least chunking them with one shot. And then for our fifth build, we're actually going to be staying with the M1000 Classic, but this time we're going to be using a clean overclock. We're going to be using Minimal Clips. Minimal Clips is a fantastic overclock that gives you faster reload speed and larger magazine size, so you can hold up to 18 rounds, which we're going to make use of. And since the M1000 has high enough damage to one-shot grunts on has 5, that's fine. At least if you hit him in the head, it will one-shot him. If you focus shot them with the armor breaking in Tier 2, you will also one-shot them with body shots, which is very useful. The way I have it built is the same way we were building Hipster, so extra ammo in Tier 1. This is actually even more useful on this particular overclock than on Hipster. Armor breaking in Tier 2, so we can get those nice juicy focus shots. Larger mag size in Tier 3, because this one takes advantage of it, and we have 18 rounds or 9 focus shots, however you want to look at that. Blow through rounds in Tier 4, so we can potentially use our focus shot to punch through up to 3 enemies. That's really good for crowds. And then faster reloads in Tier 5, but you can pick any of them in Tier 5. Stun is also really good. I like running that. And this is pretty simple. You can use the M1000 for any sort of crowd or any sort of big enemy, and you will just have more ammo than you otherwise would, as well as a faster reload. Might not be the strongest for crowd control once they get up close, but that's where our secondary comes in. And this is going to seem like a little bit of an odd one, or at least it would in previous seasons, but we're going to be using Double Barrel. Double Barrel has been changed from a clean overclock that did basically nothing except for hinder you to an unstable overclock that is super fun now and very strong. I like it a lot. It's really good for crowd control. So Double Barrel now cuts down on your overall ammunition, as well as it makes it so you have much wider spread than you otherwise would, having 50% more spread. However, you get more damage with a blast cone directly in front of the shotgun, dealing very high damage to everything. The way I like building is like this, going with extra ammo in Tier 1 so we have more shots. We don't want to go with double trigger in Tier 2. There's no reason to take it. That's just a dead skill. Take the faster reload speed. That's the only real option that we have here. More ammo in Tier 3, although you could go with more pellets if you want even more damage. That also works. or even the stun. Stun kind of works too with double barrel. Increase shockwave in tier 4, which I'm glad that the shockwave actually has a purpose now. That's really cool. And then white phosphorus rounds in tier 5. You could also go with the auto reload or the Fear the Boomstick in tier 5. Both are really good with this weapon. I just like having a fire so that if something doesn't die, it will likely be on fire and then will die shortly afterwards. Or at least be easier to see for a couple seconds till I shoot it again with the boomstick. Double barrel is really cool now. It's very strong up close. This build is also really strong if you want to take the pheromone canisters, throw that into a crowd and just walk right up next to it with the boomstick, and you'll probably clear off everything. Once you are using the boomstick, you want to get very, very close though. For our 6th build, we're going to be moving back to the GK2, and this time we're going to be using Bullets of Mercy. Bullets of Mercy is a pretty good overclock that did get a little bit changed when the GK2 got changed, to where if an enemy is afflicted by a status, and this now includes basically all status effects, so now corrosion and pheromones and all that, you now do 50% more damage towards that enemy. That is pretty cool. That deals a lot of damage. This does come at the downside of our magazine size being a little bit lower, but that's okay. The way I like building it is like this for full damage. Faster rate of fire in tier 1, more damage in tier 2, larger mag size in tier 3. That does help you go up to 24 rounds, so it's not that big of a deal. Weak spot damage in tier 4, although armor breaking is also pretty good with this. And then more rate of fire in tier 5. Some people like to run stun in tier 5 for this one, which does kind of work. I don't think it's really necessary to run this because you're likely going to have other status effects from your secondary and from your grenades and from your team. So you don't necessarily need to trigger the status effect just to get Bullets of Mercy to work with the GK2 by itself. Another thing I should go over is that Bullets of Mercy does not stack with multiple effects triggered. So if something's on fire and something's under the use of pheromones, and maybe it has corrosion on it too, you're not going to suddenly get 50% per status effect that you get. It's just 50% if they're under the status effect of any sort of status. Now for a secondary weapon, we are going to be taking something that can trigger this. We're going to be taking Cryo Minelets on the Zukovs. Cryo Minelets is a pretty good overclock for dealing with crowds. It makes it so dealing with crowd swarms is very easy, and freezing enemies is also very useful if you like running the vampire perk. That way you can just walk up and smack them with your pickaxe. So I'm going to be taking extra ammo in tier 1. I like this more than damage with the Cryo Minelets. You don't usually need it because if enemies are frozen, you usually just switch over to your primary and deal more damage. Faster reloads in tier 2, but take whatever you'd like in tier 2. More accuracy in tier 3. This is your choice, pick whichever one of these you like. Blow through rounds in tier 4, I would highly recommend that one. That way you can punch through an enemy, stick a Cryo Minelet either behind or underneath them, and then have it go off so that it can potentially freeze them. And then conducted bullets in tier 5, but you could take get in, get out, whichever one you'd like. If you're not running electricity, either with the IFG or with the boomerang, then get in, get out is pretty good too. Usually I just use this for picking off anything with the GK2 normally, and then if there is larger crowds of enemies, I'll usually switch over to the Zukovs, try to freeze them, and then switch back to GK2 to pick them off, or just use my pickaxe to pick them off. This one can work really well against big enemies, but I wouldn't recommend trying to freeze necessarily everything with the Cryo Minelets, because it doesn't freeze detonators super quick, unless you combine this with like your cryo grenades too. Fire a round of this, throw a cryo grenade, it should freeze it then, and then switch to your GK2 so that you deal high damage. So if you are running that, then that also works. If not, then probably don't try to do that too much unless you also have like a cryo driller on your team or something. Moving from a cryo scout to a fire scout, we're going to be using the Drac as our primary weapon in Weapon Loadout 7. This is going to be the thermal exhaust feedback overclock, which makes it so once we start hitting the red heat meter, or I think maybe it's up to the yellow heat meter, we will then start dealing extra fire damage with our Drac, and we can light things on fire with it, which is pretty awesome. Downside is that the Drac can overheat quicker and it overheats for longer, so you don't really want to be doing that. The way I have it built is like this, going with increased velocity in tier 1. I like this option just so that we can hit targets at a distance a little bit easier. Extra ammo in tier 2, that way we can just fire for longer. In tier 3, I like going with the cooldown. This does make it pretty manageable, and I would recommend this one once you're getting used to thermal exhaust feedback, because the heat can be kind of a problem. And in certain situations where everything is going a little bit crazy, you will need to show some restraint so that your Drac doesn't overheat a lot. In tier 4, I'm going with electricity. You could go with the splash plasma or with the armor breaking. They're both okay for this too, but I like the electricity the best. And then the thermal feedback so that we can potentially kill things faster, at least once we start getting heated up. Then for a secondary weapon, we're just going to be embracing the fire, where we are going to be taking the Bolt Shark. And for this, we're going to be taking fire bolts. So this way we can stick fire bolts into enemies or on the ground and light things on fire. This build in particular is not going to be very good for a Dreadnought mission because you can't light them on fire, but it should work very well on every other mission type, assuming you get enough things that you can light on fire, which is usually a lot of them. The way I build fire bolts is like this. Pheromone bolts in tier 1. This is very useful for fire bolts because you stick this into a large enemy and then stick 2 fire bolts into them, like say an oppressor or a praetorian, and then all the other grunts just swarm around it, light themselves on fire, and you save a ton of ammo that way. Extra ammo in tier 2 because we can't get our ammo back once we shoot a firebolt, although firebolts do linger on the ground, so they are good just to stick in the ground if you have bugs chasing you. That will usually light them on fire if you just keep kiting them, keep running away. Faster reload in tier 3, just to switch back and forth between the firebolt and the pheromone bolt a little bit quicker. Movement speed in tier 4, since we're not going to get much value out of the recalling the bolts. And then potent bolts in tier 5, that way firebolts and the pheromone bolts last even longer, or at least the pheromone bolts last even longer, so more enemies will congregate around the enemies that are on fire and light themselves on fire. Very simple. This is really good for single targets, and it's really good for crowds. Again, not super great for Dreadnought missions, but that's about the only mission type that this build is going to struggle on. For build number 8, we're going to be going back to the GK2 again, and this time we're going to be using the overclocked firing mechanism. This is a balanced overclock that gives you double the recoil, but it gives you more rate of fire. And the way I like to build this is all rate of fire so that we can have a lot of DPS. May not be the easiest to control, but it is super fun. In tier 1, I like going with faster rate of fire, so we can get more DPS. More ammo in tier 2, although damage is pretty good here too. You can actually do a lot of damage per second with this one if you want to go with that. But I do find myself running through bullets pretty fast. Larger mag size in tier 3, but a lot of people really like the recoil reduction in tier 3, and if you do take that, it just takes the GK2 back down to the base recoil. Armor breaking in tier 4, because this one is pretty good for dealing with crowds, although weak spot damage is also really good too. And then faster rate of fire in tier 5, so that we can have the max rate of fire at 14, which this does run through ammo very fast, but it also shreds enemies extremely fast too. Then for a secondary weapon, we're also going to be taking a super fun overclock over here. This is going to be special powder for the boomstick. Everybody loves special powder. It's a super fun overclock, unless you get super tiny caves, in which case it's not as useful then. But in big open caves, it's super fun. What special powder does is once you jump up in the air and you fire the boomstick, you get flung in the opposite direction. You do have to be careful with this, because if you jump in the air and shoot it upward, you might just smash your feet into the ground and kill yourself, because fall damage is based on velocity more so than distance. So the way I like building this is going with extra ammo in tier 1, that way I can just use this overclock more often. Faster reload in tier 2, but double trigger is also really good in tier 2, pick whichever one you'd like. More ammo in tier 3, so I can use this more often. Blow through rounds in tier 4, because that one's really useful for crowds. And then white phosphorus rounds in tier 5, so we can have some fire on our shotgun. The boomstick is still really good at clearing up smaller enemies and smaller swarms. It clears up grunts no problem and hits big things pretty hard. It also has a very high chance of stunning them. It's not too uncommon to just hit a Praetorian with this and they can't really move for a second and you can reposition. You could also just forego using this for crowds or for enemies altogether and just use it all for mobility. That way you can get missions done very fast. Whichever way works, or a combination of both is more likely what you're going to be using this for. Then for our 9th build, we have AI Stability Engine on the GK2. This is a super cool overclock. This makes it so you have no recoil and basically no spread with the GK2, but you do have slightly less damage and less rate of fire. That's not such a big deal though, because this one did get reworked when the GK2 got reworked, and now the damage drop-off is not as bad as it used to be. Because before you basically wanted to stack all damage on this just so that you could kill things like swarmers with one shot. That was kind of annoying. And so that you could deal a little bit more damage to large targets. Now, since the GK2 has gotten reworked and some of its mods have changed places, you can make this really, really strong. The way I like building it is like this. So I'm going with increased rate of fire in tiers 1 and 5. This just makes it so we go up to a little bit above average rate of fire with the GK2. That is very nice. Extra damage in tier 2, but you could go with more ammo. Damage just makes it so you clear up big enemies even faster. Larger mag size in tier 3. Don't go with the recoil reduction. You get nothing from it. It already has 0 recoil, so having another 100% recoil reduction doesn't make it so you have negative recoil reduction or something. I don't know how that would work. And then more weak spot damage in tier 4. This will make it so we have 70% more damage when we are hitting the weak spots of enemies, which should be very easy with a gun that has no spread and has no recoil. Somewhat downside to this weapon is that it's not super great against crowds. It still can kill them very fast because you're just hitting crowds in the weak spots, but it can struggle once bugs start getting really close to you. And that's what we have our secondary for. For our secondary, we're going to be running gas recycling. This is an unstable overclock for the Zhukovs that also got buffed, which I thought was kind of weird when it got buffed because I was already a fan of this, but hey, it got even stronger. That's really cool. This one makes it so you move slower when you're firing the Zhukovs, as well as they have more spread, and you can't hit weak spots at all with this. So you get no weak spot bonus damage whatsoever. That includes the extra 15% that the Zukobs have on them base, as well as just hitting weak spots in general, which usually gives you 2 to 3 times more damage. You can't do that anymore with this overclock. I used to think that you could, but it turns out you can't. I always thought it was just the extra 15% from the weapon, but I was wrong about that. For having all those downsides, we get more damage overall, and we also get armor breaking. We get a lot of armor breaking with this. So in tier 1, I'm going with extra ammo. You could go with more damage. Going full damage with this one can be pretty fun for just shredding through crowds quickly, but more ammo is usually better for a long sustained mission than anything else. In tier 2 though, pick whichever one of these you'd like. They're all really good. Reduced spread in tier 3. This one's pretty useful for this one in particular, because otherwise you have 150% base spread, I think, which is pretty noticeable, and it makes it so close range is really the only range you have with the Zukovs. With this, it still makes it so medium range is achievable, although again, if you just want to stack damage and shred crowds at close range, you can do that too. Blow through rounds in tier 4, this is really useful for crowds. Don't go with the weak spot damage in tier 4, that's a dead skill, you won't get anything from it. And then in tier 5, your choice. I'm going with conductive bullets, because we can get a little bit more damage if we're using boomerangs or IFGs. And this build is very, very strong with IFGs for crowds. You just shred right through them. The way I like to use this build is when enemies start getting really close, use the Zukovs to clear them off. And when enemies at a distance, use the GK2 to pick them off. It's extremely easy to pick off enemies at a distance with the new AI stability engine. It does a lot of damage, and with no recoil and no spread, you can pick off leeches from a distance, you can pick off spitballers, you can pick off Mactera. Whatever threat you see at a distance, you can pick off super easy and extremely fast. And then for our 10th and final build, we are going back to the Drak as our primary weapon, and we're going to be using Overtuned Particle Accelerator. This gives us a lot more damage, however, we are far less accurate than normal with the Drak, so close range is our only range with this one. And we also have more heat generation from this, so our gun can overheat a little bit quicker, as well as we have less ammo overall, so we can run through ammo a little bit quicker. That being said, this is pretty devastating at close range. It can just shred through crowds, and so long as you're comfortable at fighting at melee range or close to melee range, this one can be very strong. It also works really well if you want to pair this with Melee Scout and go with something like Berserker as your one of your active perks. That can be really strong. So the way I like building it is less heat in tier 1, more ammo in tier 2, that will take us back up to normal ammo, faster cooling in tier 3, that way we can just use the weapon more often. More electricity in tier 4, that way we're just doing a little bit more damage, although armor breaking with this one can work, and splash can also work. Splash is usually what I take if I'm running this on like a Swarmageddon mission. And then the feedback loop in tier 5 so that we can have increased rate of fire once our gun starts getting heated up. So to make up for our lack of range with our primary weapon, we're going to go with the secondary weapon that has range. And we're going to be taking the Bolt Shark once again. This time we're going to be taking Specialist. This makes it so we can have more special bolts than we otherwise would. You can take whatever special bolt you'd like. For this one I took explosives, but electricity and pheromone also work really well. This one's just a super solid overclock for any type of mission. You can build it however you would like. Extra ammo in tier 2, although you could take extra special bolts in tier 2 as well and have a bunch of them. That's pretty fun. Faster reload speed in tier 3, faster movement in tier 4, and then the Banshee module in tier 5. That way we can scare away enemies. Basically, you're just going to be using the crossbow for anything at long range. So Mactera, Spitballers, menaces, turrets, stuff like that. And then you're going to be using the drag for anything that you can get right up close to, which Scout is very good at. The grappling hook does make it so you can engage very close, very quickly, and then get out of there. Again, this one will take a little bit getting used to because you do have to be fairly comfortable at fighting at close to melee range with Scout. So thank you guys so very much for watching this. This was 10 strong builds for Scout. We're going to be doing this for the other classes too. These will be coming out a little bit slow because it does take a little while to make these. But thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Tell me your thoughts and your favorite builds down in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And I will talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye, everybody!